A federal inquiry into Rio Tinto's destruction of the Juukan Gorge in Western Australia's remote Pilbara could be suspended indefinitely. The inquiry's chair, Warren Entsch, will ask his fellow parliamentary committee members to pause the probe as pandemic restrictions prevent them from holding face-to-face meetings with traditional owners. Due to WA's hard border, members have been unable to visit the Pilbara, where the 46,000-year-old rock shelters were destroyed. Rio Tinto destroyed the Juukan Gorge in May on permissions granted under Section 18 in 2013. In 2014, archaeological surveys led by Dr Michael Slack confirmed one of the sites that was blasted was of the highest archaeological significance in Australia. Following the fallout from the detonation, Rio Tinto launched an internal board review led by Michael L'Estrange. Despite Dr Slack's report, the board review states that Chief Executive Jean-Sébastien Jacques was first made aware of the exceptional archaeological and cultural significance of the Juukan rock shelters on the 24th of May, the day the blast was detonated and the caves were severely impacted. It also refers to the linked-up decision-making that was lacking at critical points in the processes leading up to the site's destruction. He says Rio Tinto failed to meet some of its own internal standards and procedures in relation to the responsible management and protection of cultural heritage. Some decisions taken and judgments made at different points in time over a long period lacked contextual awareness. Now, in light of the review's findings, the company's Remuneration Committee recommended that Chief Executive Jean-Sébastien Jacques, Group Executive Corporate Relations Simone Niven, and Chief Executive of Iron Ore Chris Salisbury be stripped of their bonuses. My first guest this afternoon is Indigenous leader Noel Pearson. Noel Pearson, welcome.
Thank you.
You've written about the destruction of these ancient caves. What work does Rio Tinto need to do to repair its relationship with traditional owners and to restore trust?
There's got to be truth and accountability. That's the starting place. Truth to the traditional owners, to the Australian public, and to the wider world. There can be no moving forward until the full truth is disclosed. And then there has to be accountability for that truth.
There has been some accountability. There's been a reduction in bonuses. Why is this insufficient in your view?
Well, the board undertook a review by one of its members, Michael L'Estrange, and the board report that was released was a whitewash. It did not reveal the truth. There are many unanswered questions. The review was evasive and it made no connection between the penalty that it exacted from the CEO and from the head of Iron Ore and from the head of corporate relations and whatever act of omission or commission they have been held responsible for. There's nothing in the review report that tells us what the CEO and the head of Iron Ore and the corporate relations head did in order to incur the penalty that the board exacted from them. Now, that penalty was a very minor impost. It's pocket money, small pocket money compared to the salaries that these executives receive from Rio Tinto. So the problem with the L'Estrange review is that it doesn't discuss why it is that the board decided to levy this penalty. We don't know what they did or what they didn't do in their roles as the senior executives of the company. The truth about what was omitted or what was committed by these officers of the company need to be properly disclosed, and it is my view that the submission that the company put forward to the Parliamentary Committee on Northern Australia is not a full disclosure. It is evasive. It is failing to answer in a straightforward manner many of the questions that they've been put on notice about. And of course, this board review that Michael L'Estrange has prepared is similarly opaque and really does not represent an honest and thorough coming to grips with the facts of what happened in the lead up to the destruction of the Juukan Caves. It is completely insufficient. If the board thought that the L'Estrange report was sufficient, was a sufficient explanation for this tragedy. I say tragedy, but it's only a tragedy if it was a mistake. It is only a cultural tragedy if the company committed a mistake, and this is the result of poor communication and lack of linked up decision making, as L'Estrange describes it. But we don't even know whether it's just a tragic mistake. We don't. In fact, a lot of evidence points towards willful knowledge. Everybody was aware of the high cultural values involved here. Whereas the L'Estrange review accepts this line that the senior executives of the company were not aware of the exceptional cultural values involved. The fact that this heritage is 46,000 years old. The L'Estrange review accepts that somehow the senior managers of the company were not aware of this. Now, that is simply not believable. Let's return to your original question. What does the company need to do? Well, before it can do anything to atone for its for the damage to the Juukan site here, the first thing's got to be done is the truth, the full truth, and nothing but the truth has got to be disclosed here. And until we have the truth and then the accountability that flows from that truth, then there will be no moving forward for this. It's not as if you can say, nothing to see here, let's move on. Let's repair the relationships on the ground. Let's move to a new era of good relations between traditional owners and the company. I don't think that will come. That cannot come.
What are the implications for Indigenous communities? Not only this community, but throughout this country with this company. What are the lessons in terms of the interactions between the company and traditional landowners?
Well, Rio Tinto were the leading company. We thought they were since the mid-90s, really, since after the Native Title Act, because the Australian CEO at the time made it the leading company in the world. That is because they took a 180-degree turn. They were a very bad company before Leon Davis turned the wheel of that company, turned the big steering wheel of that company around, and they started to do the right thing based on respect and recognition of native title. I was there. I was a young man when that happened, almost 25 years ago. But whether that the company has slipped from those high principles that it signed up to under Leon Davis, or whether that was all a charade over the last 2.5 decades is a real question in my mind now. Was Rio Tinto really serious about the change that took place after the Native Title Act was implemented? Because every indication from this Juukan episode is telling me, and it's telling other Indigenous leaders, it's telling the wider Australian public, it's telling the investor community all around the world that this company is not in fact serious about Indigenous cultural heritage. The way they think about heritage seems to be it's a problem that's got to be managed rather than a great value that should be recognised and protected. The coexistence between mining and the protection of that heritage is, of course, a great challenge and a great difficulty, but that coexistence is possible. That's what the company believes. And but it's not been shown here that mining can coexist with the preservation of such extraordinary cultural values. I mean, these cultural values about the human race. This is about how human beings over the planet lived in a place 46,000 years ago. You know, we can hardly imagine 1,000 years or 2,000 years. If for Christians and so on who trace their heritage back to 2,000 years ago, we can barely imagine that. But here we're talking about a site where humans occupied land and left evidence of their occupation going back 46,000 years. This is how extraordinary Australia is. And this was how extraordinary the Juukan caves were before they were vandalised. And I think that's I think there's a acceptance that we have lost a very great thing here. But what Rio Tinto seems not to have accepted is that the starting place for the future has got to be the telling of the truth. Not lawyers playing, passing the facts of what happened and being evasive and opaque. This has got to be about returning to the truth. It's not time to talk about reparation or compensation or any of that. The important thing at this stage of the game still is what happened. What were the true events that led to the destruction, and who, based on that truth, needs to be held accountable for it.
Due to COVID-19, members of the parliamentary inquiry are unable to travel to WA and to make their own assessments. Are you confident that the committee can get to the bottom of what happened here? You mentioned reparations, saying that's for a later conversation, but do reparations need to be on the table?
Oh, that's for the traditional owners. That is, my contribution as an Indigenous leader who has dealt with this company in Cape York. I have a history of dealing with this company going back a couple of decades. We were one of the first agreements negotiated with Rio Tinto over 20 years ago. My concern here is that this affects traditional owners all over the country where Rio Tinto has its operations. It affects Indigenous people around the world. This is relevant to Rio Tinto's social and cultural license to operate all around the world. That is how fundamental this Juukan issue is. It's now an issue that's gone beyond the Pilbara. It is a national and international question about the social and cultural license to operate of one of the world's largest mining and resource companies. And I have to say, I've read all of the transcripts and all of the documents that have been put forward to the Parliamentary Committee. The Parliamentary Committee, all of the members seem to be doing a very diligent job. They're outraged. My sense from reading the questions from the politicians that there is a universal outrage here about what Rio Tinto have done. I think the key question is going to be, has Rio been unequivocal, forthright and honest in the answers that they've supplied to the committee? because it seems to me that there's a lot of evasion and lack of straightforwardness in some of the answers that they're providing to the committee. And the committee will have to watch for that. The committee will have to be aware of the areas where the story just does not add up. And the question of accountability will need to be considered by the company. In my view, the company's heading down the wrong road as we speak. They're going down the wrong road in dealing with this. They think that they can get beyond this issue by taking a defensive line and taking a line that doesn't represent full disclosure of the truth.
On another issue, you've written about the impact of coronavirus income support payments on Indigenous communities. What are you concerned about?
Well, the impact on alcohol, gambling, and the social chaos that those two things cause in our communities. It's a problem in Cape York and across other remote communities around the country. We always think that, it's important that people who live on very low incomes have access to more food and more resources for their families and so on. But when you drop whole amounts of additional cash into communities that are struggling with alcohol and gambling and drugs, then you can actually create a bigger problem. And that's what we're seeing. The amount of chaos that's been generated by the increase in job seeker cash payments. I would like to see communities and families being supported with extra resources without fueling the grog and drug and gambling problems that are particularly out of control now. I mean, we've been grappling with these problems for decades now, and limiting the supply of alcohol, helping people to manage their money and limit the amount of cash available has been, the subject of a lot of intensive action by those of us that are trying to make life more manageable and safer for children and family members and women and so on. So when the government just drops a whole lot more cash on the streets of these communities without thinking about ways in which you can provide these opportunities in ways that don't create a bonanza for sly grog dealers, for drug dealers, and for gambling venues, pokey machine venues, and so on. There seems to be no thought given when these monies are distributed about the social effects of increased cash sloshing around the communities. And I think I'm just urging the Australian government to have a look at what's going on and work with community leaders to see if there's ways in which we can limit the negative social impact that's resulting from the increase in cash payments.
Noel Pearson, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Patricia.